Welcome to Stranger Encounters. I am Tommy Salmons. Before we get started today, I wanted to remind everybody that there is still accepting donations on part of Justin Raimondo to assist him with medical bills and fight his cancer. It looks like since the last time I mentioned this on the podcast, they have raised another $40,000, which is a positive. He's still about $15,000 short of the $80,000 goal. So please go to antiwar.com and donate to Justin Raimondo as he fights lung cancer. I struggle with this episode because it's I'm gonna have to get into some personal anecdotes, I guess would be the best term. So I've been trying to figure out how to maneuver through this in such a way that I don't feel like I am unfairly attacking people. I don't even know if unfair is the right word to use. So, this one might be a little heavier edited than others as I go through and delete pauses or rethink how to best express myself. Maybe I should have written it down because I feel like I'm better at writing and expressing myself through writing, but I feel like probably would abandon the idea if I were to sit and really start trying to draft it. And I think it's an important subject to cover. It's one that I feared might happen. So I'm gonna tackle this as philosophically as I possibly can, and be as honest as I possibly can with myself and about myself. So as a few of y'all, as you've heard in the past episodes, as I've covered in a few episodes, I joined the military, but the subject of military goes, it stretches back before the action of joining. I had kids really young. I was I don't know. I'm 19 when my first son was born, and got married the next summer. Within 2 years, my daughter was born. And then a year after that, actually it was like 9 months, 10 months, 10 and a half months after that, I had another son born. In between my daughter's birth and my second son's birth, I was working as a shipping and receiving guy. I wasn't a manager. I was basically the night manager, but that was only because we ran a skeleton crew at night. There were three of us working. There was the supervisor, there was myself unloading trucks as they came in, and then there was one production guy. I was working at a book bindery, and it sounds better than it was. This was ghetto as hell in Houston. We did menus for like catering events. I remember one time we did a menu for Taco Bell, a catering event Taco Bell was doing. This was nothing glorious. This was a shit job, making shit money, working shit hours. And being young and married, wife pregnant for the third time in a 4-year period, it wasn't easy. Things were difficult. Money was tight. We were struggling. We were trying to figure things out. Neither of us went to college. She was working as a teacher's assistant for somewhere around like, I want to say it was like $15,000 to $18,000 a year. I was making somewhere around like $8.50 an hour, something like that. By this time I'd say I was 20 at this time. I had done construction. I had been a sandblaster. I'd been a painter. I tried my hands at pretty much anything. As long as it was an upward move financially, I was willing to do whatever it took to provide for my family. Being young and inexperienced made it really difficult. And I talk about this because Thaddeus Russell actually, and I mentioned this in the last solo podcast I did. Thaddeus Russell discusses how libertarians don't recognize class. But class is a reality to some of us. Some of us have always struggled. And I have scratched and clawed and fought my way up the ladder. And my obsession has never been with money. You'll hear people tell you that when you're poor, like you think about nothing but money. But that's not true. My obsession has been with comfort. Just being comfortable. That's all I wanted, was to be comfortable. And I know, like, as far as world standards go, I live a really comfortable life. I may still to this day basically live paycheck to paycheck, but you compare it with the third world, and my life's very comfortable. You know, I'm pretty much able to do most of the things I want to do. As far as podcasting, I can afford to read. You know, I can I can afford internet and these things. And I've always had, a great family that's willing to help. And without, I've never had to turn to government for assistance. I've never wanted to turn to government for assistance. I'm still of the mindset that turning to government for assistance is shameful. It's disgraceful. I don't even like asking those that are willing to help me for assistance if at all possible. And if somebody offers, typically I'll just I'll figure it out, and I may have to scrape by and eat ramen, but I figure it out, and it's not a big deal to me. But for some people, for the working class, for those of us who didn't always approach life in a forward direction and we were living in the present, yeah, their class is a reality, and moving from class to class has become more and more difficult the more and more the government has involved itself within the legislation and regulatory structure of the economy. But that wasn't an easy decision to or idea to see as someone who is poor. And so I do empathize with those progressives and socialist thinking people that look to the government. I do have empathy for them. I do sympathize with them. I do kind of understand why they look at things that way. Because when you're working for pennies on a dollar and you're barely scraping by and you're watching, a supervisor who's living a decent life, and you work and work and work, and that supervisor loses his job, and then you apply for a job and you're flat out told our production would drop if we were to give you a promotion, so therefore you have to stay where you are. So basically I was, being told that I was going to have to settle for second best in my own life in order to provide top-notch production for the company I worked for. And I've been told this several times. It's not just happened once. So there's a certain amount of empathy and sympathy I feel towards those people that don't understand the economics, don't even think about things on an economic scale, but think about things on a personal level and just like, hey, look, this is how this affects me. So screw your economics, and I do understand that. I disagree with the tactic, but I do understand where they're coming from. So in this process, rather than applying for financial aid, as we scratched and clawed, I signed up for the military. I was like, I never wanted to go to college, but if I joined the military, I spent 6 years in the military. I get credited for basically a bachelor's degree in college, and I can do what I want to do. And what I wanted to do at that time, and it was something I always aspired to, and I had talked about it quite a few times, was I wanted to get into become a private investigator. I thought, my mom worked with them a lot with her with her job, and I knew it wasn't glorious, like Angel Heart. I wasn't gonna be Mickey Rourke down in New Orleans, but at the same time, it was very intriguing to me. The idea of being a private investigator. So I kind of idolized that idea. And so I joined the military. I scored very high on the ASVAB. I was actually in the top 5%. I think I got one question on the entire test wrong. And they tried to push me into the nuclear program. But what I wanted to do was thrill seeking. I've always been an adrenaline junkie. I like it. Just jumping out of airplanes, freaking, riding motorcycles. That's what I enjoy. I like the feeling, the freedom. And that might be why I'm attracted to the philosophy of anarchy, is the freedom, that thrill of being my own man and not following the rules. The rebel without a clue would be a good description of me. When I went into the military, I really didn't know what to expect. I didn't know anybody that had ever been in the military, and training was a cool experience. Like, no doubt. I signed up to be an Army Ranger, to go through infantry training, airborne school, and then Ranger. They call it RIP, Ranger Indoctrination Program. And I went in and went through basic training. Got to shoot a lot of guns. Got to shoot, got to blow things up, just testosterone filled boy shit. And it was fun. It was fun. And you don't initially see what is being done to you mentally when you join the military. You're not aware of what they are doing to you, of what they're turning you into. A lot of people talk about MK Ultra and the program, how they use drugs and sensory deprivation and things of this nature to alter people's states of mind and try to create a super soldier and this, that, and the other. Well, they succeeded in some ways. They have completely figured out how to tear apart a group of young men and young women. They've figured out how to completely deconstruct their mental makeup and their preconceived notions and shape them mentally into what they want them to be. And I think the most important part of this is getting a hold of the recruits directly out of high school at a young age, 17, 18 years old, in which the frontal cortex hasn't completely developed. They're straight out of this entire education system into which all they're taught is to obey. and to be a good little citizen and do as you're told. And so when you take a child directly from the public education system and put them into the atmosphere of basic training, you're not only it's a natural progression, a natural evolution, because you've already spent 12 years learning how to be a good citizen and how to obey what you're told to do. But when you get into the military, they teach you to do it without a conscience. And conscience. Yeah, conscience. Sorry. And it becomes very robotic. And yeah, you're made uniform within your group. And though that's part of the objective, another part of the objective, or I'd say the most important part of the objective, is following orders without question. There's a joke that's told around the military, and it's told different ways depending on which branch of the military you're in. But the general concept is, and this is how I heard it in the Army, is there's a Navy admiral, a Marine admiral, and an Army general walking around a training facility. And the Navy admiral looked at the other two officers and said, "You want to see how well trained my men are?" And they said, "Yeah." And so he walked up to a sailor and he said, "Sailor," and he handed him a gun. He handed him a 45. He said, "Put this gun in your mouth and pull the trigger." The sailor put the gun in his mouth, squeezed the trigger. Click, it was empty. The Marine said, "Oh, that's nothing. Watch this." He said, "Hey, Marine." Marine turned around and looked, and the admiral threw a grenade. The Marine jumped on it. Boom, he was dead. The Army general said, "Y'all ain't got shit. Watch this." He turned over to a soldier on a scaffold. He said, "Hey, soldier." The soldier looked around. He said, "I want you to jump off that scaffold and land right here in the position of attention." And that soldier said, "Fuck you, sir," and went back to work. And he said, "Now he's well trained. He knows just to do his job." So I probably butchered it. It's been a long time since I heard it, but that's the general concept of it. The point being that your job is the most important part of being in the military, and you are to do your job without thinking. But you're also supposed to follow orders without thinking. And so, as I said, that joke is told different ways in different branches, because each branch propagandizes their soldiers, their recruits, to believe that they are the only one that offers any sort of autonomy to the soldiers. But none of them offer autonomy. They all expect you to follow orders without asking. No questions asked. Just do what you're told. And I'm reminded of the book I was just reading, Ordinary Men. And in 1942, Nazi Germany had expanded into Poland. And had expanded into Poland, and they didn't have enough military. They didn't have enough soldiers to perform the functions needed to occupy Poland. So what they did is they drafted older blue collar workers, mechanics, and construction workers, and this and the other. And they drafted them into a police battalion. And these workers were in between the ages of mid 30s to up into their 50s. And they put them in the police battalion, and they were sending them into these Polish cities and ordering them to execute Jews. And the way they executed them was pretty disgusting. Some of them did get put on trains and sent to labor camps, but many of them got brought out into the woods, and they would put the bayonet at the base of their neck and squeeze the trigger and shoot them through the neck. Because if they shot them through the head, they would get brain matter all over them, and it would make them sick. Now, somewhere between 5 and 10% of those ordered to do this refused. They would go hide. They would try to get out of it any way possible. Somewhere around 20% of them did it only because, I'm sorry, about 70% of them did it because they thought it would be, they weren't incapable or they believed that it was illegal, quote unquote, to disobey a direct order. Many of them would be put on these firing lines into which the Jews would be laid on their stomach in front of them, and they'd walk up and straddle the Jew and then put the bayonet on the base of their neck and squeeze the trigger and shoot him in through the neck. They would be expected to perform this function until they were so rattled from the horrors of what they were doing that they just could not steady the bayonet long enough to actually shoot the victim laying before them. Then they would be relieved and replaced with another officer from the police battalion. But 20% of those that were engaged in these executions were enthusiastic about it. And they dehumanized the Jews. They didn't see them as people. They saw them as others or animals or whatever. And they bragged about it and joked about it. And you have to imagine that in some ways this was taking place because they needed to justify their own actions. But those 70% that went through with these actions despite their conscience speaking to them and telling them what they were doing was wrong, were probably the worst of the group. They're the ones who could have stood up and stopped these actions. But they didn't. They were just following orders. Now, you'll hear libertarians rail about that term. I'm just following orders. Because there's good precedent for libertarians to rail about that term. The idea that you can take 30, 40, and 50-year-old men and you can put them in this position, and after only a year, they're actually comfortable with just following orders. And they see that as a good excuse for committing the worst atrocities of humankind is devastating. That's what they're doing to the youth when the youth goes into basic training. They're teaching them to just follow orders. But anyway, we'll get back into my story a little bit. I think this episode's going to be longer than I expected. I enjoyed my job. Infantry. I was good at it. I'm pretty good with a rifle. I enjoyed jumping out of airplanes. I was airborne. I did not make it through RIP, and I had suffered an injury in airborne school, and it was not completely healed when RIP started, and I was incapable of participating fully in RIP, and so I did not make it through that. But I ended up getting stationed at the 82nd Airborne. But that's beside the point. In the meantime, while I'm in basic training, I have a wife that I'm able to call once a week, every Sunday. And she's pregnant. She gives birth on June 25th to my son, my middle son, my third son, or my second son, my third child. And it just tore me up, like not being able to be there. I cried for probably about 2 days. But I knew, I had, by this time I had already formed a bond with quite a few people. There's one person in particular I'm thinking of that I could still get a hold of today if I needed to. Really good guy that I was in basic with, and we were both at Fort Bragg together. And he, I'm sorry. And so they just reminded me, you're here, to make a better life for your family. This is why you're doing it. And there were struggles. There were things I wasn't good at. Like, the first time I ever ran 5 miles, was tough, things like that. I think I made it 4.5 miles, and I got on the cattle truck cause I fell behind, and I got on the cattle truck, and we drove half a mile and got off, and I was determined. I will never quit it. I will never quit again. That type deal. They didn't really shame you. They didn't shame me for it, but just seeing how close I was to completion and falling out. I put my head down and said, never again. Never am I going to let my mind defeat me like that. But anyway, sorry. But yeah, so I had a young wife dealing with that, a newborn child now. And it was really difficult. I don't think, even though both of us agreed that the military was a good thing, I don't think that either of us thought about the negatives, and that's it's partially because when you're young, you're very idealistic about your future. And when you do look at your future, it's nothing but, unicorns and rainbows. You know what I'm saying? And so you're looking at it and you're like, oh, there's not going to be any struggle. You're not even thinking about the possible cons. It's all pros. Oh, I can do this, and 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 I can do this. And the recruiters just feed you that. They feed right into it. They don't talk about how difficult it's going to be. They don't talk about any of these things. And they certainly don't sell the training regimen as being what it is. I went in supposed to do 3 weeks of training, or what was it? 9 weeks airborne school, not airborne, 9 weeks of basic, 4 or 5 weeks of AIT, 3 weeks of airborne school, and 3 weeks of RIP. So in my mind, which they didn't confirm this, but they didn't deny it either. In my mind, okay, I get there, I do 14, 17, 20 weeks, and then my wife joins me when I get stationed. Like, that's it, 20 weeks. Okay, what is that? That's like 3.5 months, you know? What actually happened was I got there, I was in a holdover, and I sat there for almost a month. Then I went to my platoon, which was going to be basic training and AIT all together because I was going infantry. So they put it all together as a 16-week course. And I got out and I had a month of holdover. Then I went to airborne school. Then I got out and I had a month of holdover, and then RIP started. And then I got stationed in Fort Bragg after 8 months. So they definitely don't fill you in on the possibility of having to sit around, the hurry up and wait mentality that is the military. When I got to Bragg, I noticed, probably before Bragg, I had noticed that there was a divide between my wife and myself. It didn't take long, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here because I don't really feel like it's going to add to the conversation. It didn't take long for a lot of arguments to begin every time I had an opportunity to call her. And I'd say this was during airborne school, I would guess. So we're looking at, I joined in April, and now we're in November. From November to February, whenever I got stationed in Bragg, it seemed like every time I called, we were arguing. I wasn't the same person. No doubt about it. I didn't have the same mindset. I certainly wasn't the guy I am today, but I wasn't kind, I guess is the best way of saying it. I had been totally manipulated mentally into becoming a killer. I mean, literally, that's what they were training me to do. They were training me to kill. There's no euphemism for it. There's no way else of saying it. So mentally, it was, you're either with me or you're against me. And if there was the slightest conception or perception on my part that the actions taken were out of my interest, you were suddenly an enemy. And I went into beast mode. I don't know how else to explain it other than it was a switch. It was literally, there was a flipping of a switch. I would be laughing and joking with you 1 second. And the next minute, I was completely and totally in war mode. And I think I'd like to say that I've gotten beyond that completely, but I still think part of that lives within me. That there's that drive to be a warrior in some ways, and there's still a little bit of that animosity towards others and those that are acting against my self-interest that I take on. And that was it. It probably didn't help that I already have a bad temper. So I already have like an explosive possibility within my personality. But this just added fuel to that fire. And so a conversation that started off, "Hey baby, I miss you," would end with, "Well, then you can go fuck yourself." Or something of those terms. So though I had lost like a major part of myself. I had lost the artistic part of myself that is loving and endearing and compassionate and enjoys life and enjoys nature. I had lost that. It was gone. I was something completely different. And I'm not proud of it. I'm just objectively looking at what I had become. So when February came, I got stationed in Bragg. I got leave. I went and picked up my wife and my kids, and we drove from Houston to North Carolina. I had on-base housing already. It was already furnished. I was really ready for them to come. A couple hours after she got there, she told me that she was leaving me, and the next morning she took my kids and she left. At this point, she was the enemy. She stood in between me and my goals, and had I not had enough self-control, something bad may have happened. We hear of stories of veterans that commit heinous atrocities. And when I look back at the mental state I was in, being in that environment and being in the military, I can tell you for a fact that it's perfectly possible to see what happens to a veteran who's been to war, because I had only been through training and I had already been transformed. After seeing and performing the acts of war, I can't imagine what the jumbled mess that your mind becomes and the type of monster that lives within you. Now, I didn't take any actions other than to beat myself to death. I fell into depression, very bad depression. I began to self-medicate. I was then discharged from the military honorably, but I don't feel like it was honorable the way I was acting at that time. I moved in with my parents. I'm certain they could see a difference in who I was. I don't think we ever talked about it, but maybe it's not necessary to talk about. I think what's more important is that I'm honest about who I was. I was angry. I was angry for years. And in this period of time, my now ex-wife was raising my children. I was rarely getting to see my kids, and you know, in ways that to not allow me to be influential in my children's lives. And I believe this went on forever, up to today. And it's something I have to live with, and it's really, really difficult. I always had to ask permission to see my kids. I had to deal with the fact that I was paying 60% of my income was going to child support. A lot of times I didn't have the money to see my children. I didn't even have the gas money to go pick them up, to go visit with them, to build that relationship. This did not help my mental state. I was definitely continuously going through depression. Just to make this part of the story shorter, because I know I've been rambling for 47 minutes. I probably didn't get out of this state of mind until I was about 32 years old. And I started working to be a better person. I can't blame all my struggles and all my troubles on the military. I can't blame it all on my ex-wife. But there is a specific amount of reflection into which I look back and I can see what was being done to me from many different angles. I should have probably sought some sort of professional help. But I didn't. Now, I'm saying all this to give y'all an outlook as to what shapes my current position. Why I look at the military the way I look at the military. It's not even the military per se. It's the top echelon. It's the foreign policy. It's those that are designing these programs to manipulate young men. And to make things harder on myself, I found out this week that the child that was born whenever I was in basic training 2 months before 9/11, he's joining the Marines next year after his senior year in high school. So as a father that's struggled to remain a part of my children's lives, knowing the kind of influence that has been taken from me, the knowing that I've always had to ask permission to see my kids, to see my children, and that the state was used as power against me in many ways. I have to look at how I address this particular situation. I think as much as I'd like to grab a hold of him and shake him and be like, are you fucking crazy? They want you to murder people. I have to be more diplomatic. And I have to look at things from his point of view. And in order to look at things from his point of view, I have to remember what it was like when I joined the military. I have to accept the fact that my son, very talented and athletic as he is also a fucking adrenaline junkie like his dad. That he's looking for that thrill. That going around shooting guns and jumping out of airplanes and driving Humvees through the woods, running over trees, off of cliffs, through streams, on 70-degree fucking inclines. That's fun, man. That shit's fucking fun. It's a blast. And I have to remember he's a man now. And I'm a libertarian, not an authoritarian. It's not my job to tell him what to do. It's my job to give him the best information there is so that he can make the best decisions for his life going forward. So the way I've approached this, and this is kind of the point of this podcast, I've been working up to this, is that as devastating as it is for me to think about my son in the Marines being asked to kill people, I have to empathize with why he's making this decision, what's going on in his mind. And I have to understand that he may not have all the information. Now, I might be wrong in the way I approach this. I've made mistakes in the past. And this idea of him going into the Marines is making me even more staunch in my anti-war efforts, obviously. So my approach was to tell him, hey man, number one, if you're serious about going, I know people that are still in the military today. And I can get you in touch with them and you can talk to them and find out what you're in for and what's going on. Because maybe you don't have all the information. And number two, everything the recruiter says is a lie. Number three, get single and stay single. Don't get anybody pregnant. That's going to fuck you up for a long time if you do. Number four, don't ever abandon your moral compass. Stay moral. If you are asked or ordered to do something that you know is wrong, don't do it. Number 5, before you leave, study up on PTSD. Understand what its signs are. Understand what it does to the human mind. 22 veterans a day are committing suicide. And I certainly don't want my son to be one of those statistics. I'm more afraid of the after effects of war than I am of him being in war. You look at the percentage of United States military soldiers that have gone into war, that have died in combat, it's actually not a very high percentage. Yeah, I worry about him getting killed. I worry about him getting maimed. But I'm more worried about his mind. Because you can see when somebody's physically injured. But you can't figure out, like, knowing what's going on in a person's head, knowing what's wrong with them and whether or not they actually do need professional help. Well, that's an enemy that moves in the darkness that nobody detects. I don't want my son to be a statistic. And I don't want him to go through the mental anguish and the stress that I dealt with for 11 years. But I don't have the right to tell him that he can't. All I can do is inform him. I think he knows how I feel about it. He was hesitant to talk to me about it when I first messaged him. But the lines of communication are much more important to me than me being right or him doing what I want him to do and being bitter at me his entire life. I hope my son is a Peter Van Buren. I hope my son can see what's happening over there for what it is. And he can come back and he can be a strong voice in fighting against this imperial regime. And maybe this is the path that he has to take, as much as it terrifies me, as much as I hate it. Maybe this is the right thing for him. And maybe this is the path that leads him to become a voice against the war state. I wasn't sure about this episode, man. I wasn't sure about recording this. I don't like saying I so much. I'm not near as narcissistic as I once was, so it doesn't really feel good to talk about these things. I did learn a couple of things about myself as I started to verbalize what I was thinking. I'm sure I probably deserve to catch some flack for some of the things of my past. And I'm glad that I've come to the place that I've come. I hate that I had to go through the things that I had to go through. But we all are who we are today because of yesterday. And I appreciate y'all putting up with my thoughts. This was really raw. It's not a real easy thing for me to talk about. And this is not what I had in mind for a Thursday episode. But, you know, Pete encouraged me to discuss this and to talk about my story. And I hope it helps somebody. I hope it clears something up for somebody. I'd like to thank y'all for listening. Remember, go to antiwar.com, donate to Justin Raimondo. We need those anti-war voices. And I'm Tommy Salmons. Late.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This is not a drill. This is an emergency.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero.
Now I am become death, the destroyer